Good morning, Mrs. Nichols. How are you doing today?
Good morning. Doing well. How are you?
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you for joining me today on this interview. I know you are super busy. I just thank you for joining us and telling us all about SJ Labs down there in Macon, Georgia, the first laboratory of its kind in the state. I think that's huge. And so, yeah, please introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about um, what you're doing, why it's important, and where you come from.
Sure. So my name is Sara Nicholls, or SJ Nicholls. I'm the founder and scientific director of SJ Labs and Analytics. We are the first cannabis-specific testing lab in the state of Georgia. Cannabis testing labs are really the cornerstone of a functional, regulated, and safe cannabis market.
Absolutely.
It makes sure that the products that are getting to consumers are high quality, they're consistent, they're free of pesticides, heavy metals, residual solvents, and it adds a lot of validity to our industry. So there's not second guessing. The consumer knows exactly what they're getting. Right now we work predominantly in the hemp space. We do some cannabis work specifically for like defense clients or even some police districts and things who may have questions on testing. And we will be working in the medicinal market as that starts to come online here in Georgia.
Wow. So you founded the laboratory 2019, right?
That's right. Yep. So in 2019, on January 7th, 2019, Georgia introduced the Hemp Rules for the state. Our initial Hemp Rules for growing and producing in the state of Georgia did not include a testing aspect, so the USDA did not accept those. So on January 7th of 2019, those rules were laid out to include testing and how testing was going to look in the state. Again, testing really is the cornerstone for how this market functions. And as soon as those rules were released, we put into place about a 5-year plan that we had been working on, and went ahead and got into a brick and mortar by March and took our first client in May.
Wow. So you had already been working on a plan prior to the rules being amended and requiring laboratory testing. So that was already in motion.
Yeah, we knew that the industry was coming. And so I got introduced to the industry. Really, some guys I grew up with were connoisseurs and decided when things became legal out in Colorado, they were going to go try their hand. They really want to be a part of the industry there. And they had some questions about the science of it, trying to get some of their distillations better or their grows better. And so I went out there to visit them and just fell in love with the industry. And I was really interested from an advocacy and research standpoint. I wanted to understand addiction and recovery treatment, how cannabis fit into that, and women's health are my two big research areas. And I from an advocate standpoint, believe that cannabis should be legal. So I started diving into how do I get into the research of this industry, because the thing about science is until something's legal, it's difficult to really understand. So this was a real big turning point for the scientific community in understanding cannabis or the processes that go into consumer products. So I was really excited about it. But the more digging I did, I found that these testing labs are a requirement in every single state. They have to have all this testing done before it gets to the consumer. And I just thought that's exactly what I'm doing in my job now. It would just be cannabis instead of, what I was testing there. And it was a great opportunity to have something generate income that I could then use to research what I was really passionate about, the addiction and the women's health. So
absolutely. I'm totally aligned with you on that. I have a master's in science and counseling. And so I was a connoisseur, I would say, prior to my master's study, but then I just took a totally different academic and more intellectual approach to the plant, once I started my master's, or pretty much before I enrolled. But to back up, so you had buddies that were connoisseurs. They moved to Colorado. So at what time in your life is this happening? Is this like college? Is this undergrad? Were you in high school kind of thinking about, like, was this, because I always been curious, like, was this a vision of yours, or did this just kind of come together?
This is my mid-20s. And I'm really at a transition point in my life. I had just gotten out of a long-time relationship that I had in college, and didn't really know what was next. So I think I was very probably open-minded to the industry. And at the time, 40% of the industry had women in executive positions.
Right.
And coming from the science world, I was often the only woman at the table. And I was always the youngest at the table. And so this seemed like an opportunity to get with like-minded people, like my generation. It just seemed so exciting. So I was just young. I came back and I told my dad about it. My dad said to me, if there's anybody who has the education to get into this industry, it's you. So he just sort of solidified it for me and said that this is realistic, and what would we have to do to make this work. So
so I've looked at your resume. It's very impressive. So you have the Bachelor of Science in Biology from Georgia Southern. So when you entered into Georgia Southern, was this on your mind, like, you know what, I'm going to make sure I have this biology degree, and my next step is this, my next step is that, or were you just kind of figuring it out as you went along?
Well, let's see. Georgia Southern has a reputation for the parties that we put on.
Right.
And when I entered Georgia Southern, I wanted to be an OBGYN. Again, just really interested in women's health care.
Got it.
I had never tried cannabis of any sort. And Georgia Southern offered me some opportunities there. And I realized that it wasn't what everyone had made it out to be. And me being who I am, and the questions started to kind of come up, in the curiosity. And I started to form my opinion that perhaps how we were addressing cannabis was not the right way to go about it.
Wow.
And that was around, I guess, about 19, that sort of, I started to think about it. And then it was just an evolution of thought after that. I'm still not a daily user, just because it doesn't fit into my lifestyle necessarily. But I completely support people who do. And I know people who need that to function daily, that helps them with anxiety and kind of moving through life. And I know people who do it recreationally and who don't have any medical reason to do it at all, and that's totally fine too. But yeah, I was really interested in the science, and the fact that the science was so new. People just didn't know the answers to it. There wasn't somewhere you could go Google the answer. It was really figuring it out and creating mechanisms. And that's what sort of pulled me into it. But Georgia Southern, that experience there definitely helped too.
Absolutely. Big shout out to you. I mean, you're a true pioneer in the space. I mean, I'm from California, right, where I was 13 when Prop 215 passed. So I kind of grew up in this kind of medical cannabis movement, cannabis is medicine kind of paradigm. So I brought that mentality with me to Georgia when I was a freshman at Morehouse College in 2001. But for you to be at Georgia Southern, a Georgia native, having been miseducated all these years on cannabis, right, and the rumors and the stigma and so on and so forth, and for you to really have the intellect, but also the guts to really say, you know what, I don't believe everything I've been told for the past 15 some odd years. There's something else going on here. I think that's really powerful, right? And it takes people like you to break through and say, no, this makes sense. This is going to happen. Every state is passing medical cannabis legislature. It's going to happen in Georgia eventually, right? And we know it's super limited. That's a whole nother conversation about that, right? But let's circle back, because I think a lot of listeners and viewers may not be aware of kind of the situation that we have here in Georgia, right? It's kind of tricky. I live in Atlanta. You're in Macon, right? So have they decriminalized Delta 9 THC in Macon, or is that still like, are you still running the risk of going to jail for having a joint or something?
You're running the risk, but they're unlikely, from my understanding. And this, of course, that's not necessarily my expertise, but my understanding from some of the conversations I've had with local advocates is the police, it is not their priority.
Right.
In fact, Bibb County is understaffed by like 240 police officers. So we have much bigger issues from a community level going on there in our police force and crime activity. So certainly Macon isn't the town that people are, hey, here's a joint, let me go and throw you into jail. Because the hemp law came online, the GBI will not test cannabis or plant material unless it's a felony offense.
Interesting.
So a lot of local police departments aren't prosecuting or chasing down the small amounts.
Got it.
Just because they know the GBI won't test it. And most of them are aware that their in-house tests aren't going to be sufficient to differentiate between hemp and marijuana variety cannabis.
Interesting.
But that being said, there are certainly some areas in Georgia, particularly in South Georgia or in the more rural areas of Central Georgia, who are still very adamant that, this is a drug and they're going to get it off the street, or even from just a financial standpoint, they can ticket and make money off of it. So, it really depends on where you're at in the state, which is not a great answer. And that's adding a lot of, it's not fair for you to drive from one county to the other and face prosecution in one and not have to worry about it in the other. That's not a fair way to live as a Georgia citizen. So,
oh man, well said. Well said. Very, very extremely problematic. And I agree with everything you just said. I think a lot of these counties, in my opinion, when they weigh, it's a numbers game, right? When the prosecution and criminalization of cannabis exceeds a certain number in terms of profit, in terms of ticketing, in terms of the whole law enforcement ecosystem, I feel like when they figure out how to make more money off selling it recreationally, medically, and taxing it, then all of a sudden they shift gears. But in the city of Atlanta, it's almost legal. It's crazy. When you say the police department isn't, it's not a priority for them, it's not even on Atlanta police radar at all. I mean,
yeah. And I think it's important to differentiate between decriminalization and legalization and what those two markets look like, because and this is where testing comes in. Testing, in my opinion, is really the difference between a decriminalized market and a regulated market.
Yes.
In a decriminalized market, you're still growing underground, you're still processing underground, you're still not necessarily using the best equipment, you don't know really who your source is necessarily in an underground decriminalized market. Versus a regulated market, it pulls everything above board. So you have state oversight who's going in, looking at these facilities, making sure that they're safe, clean, and good for consumers, because we are ingesting and inhaling these things, so they should be held to a higher standard.
Yes.
They're making sure that they're not using dangerous chemicals and pesticides because there are a lot of pests that infect cannabis, mites, and there's some funguses that cannabis are prone to, like powder mold. So making sure that our growers aren't using those, making sure that we're using good soil that doesn't have arsenic or
heavy metals.
Right. And in Georgia, arsenic's pretty dominant in our soil system, particularly down in tobacco farms.
Right.
And if it's a processed product, we want to make sure that people aren't inhaling ethanol, that all of that's gotten out, or butane, or whatever the process that gets it to the oil is. And so while decriminalization certainly helps from an advocacy standpoint, and we aren't targeting, because this industry has targeted minorities, or the war on drugs has specifically targeted minorities.
Absolutely.
Decriminalization removes that aspect of it, but it then doesn't give the economical opportunity back to those minorities.
Yes.
And it doesn't give the validity back to the industry. That's why regulation and legalization is such an important avenue. And I tell police officers and jurisdictions all the time, DAs, who come here to visit, that this is happening. The political argument about cannabis is over.
Right.
It is coming.
Right. The data is here now.
Yeah. The conversation becomes, how do we make this safe for the consumer?
Right.
In a way that satisfies police officers. And I had a DA stand here and he said, well, what's going to happen when this becomes legal is we're just going to have everybody standing on the corner selling marijuana laced with God knows what. And I
Not
said,
true.
no,
Not true.
that's what happens in an illegal market.
Right.
That's what happens when it's underground. But when a legal market happens, there's a checkpoint, and I'm that checkpoint.
Yes.
So what gets to the consumer is safe. We know it's not laced with PCP or Adderall or whatever other substances they may be lacing it with. We know that it doesn't have these dangerous chemicals. And most importantly, we know what consumers are consenting to consume. We know whether
Absolutely.
this is a 7% product or a 20% product. It's how we make it safe, and it's how we make it work as a market. So
absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, wow, you just said a whole lot just then. You
sorry.
No, it was amazing because when you just break down the dynamics of decriminalization, legalization, the war on minorities, and in terms of these controlled substances, it's such a heavy conversation. We could split that up into several different interviews, right? And let's circle back. So when we're talking about all these different elements you're testing for, right? Heavy metals, pesticides, is it microbials? Am I pronouncing that right?
Yeah, microbials, and we also test for
Microbials.
mycotoxins.
Right, microtoxins. I'm from California, one of the first, states in medical cannabis, highly regulated. We're in Georgia. Is there a state organization or oversight giving you a list of all of these different elements that you tested, or did you just bring that knowledge from your education, your experience in Colorado, or how is the regulation? That's my first question. How is like the regulation structure here in Georgia? And then second, are you testing for strictly CBD products, inhalables, edibles, distillate? Like what kind of actual physical products are you actually testing?
So I'll take the fast question first, which is we have the authority to test any product that's legal. Now, that being said, so that's why I can work with defense cases or with the police. We have a DEA registration, so I can test cannabis, true cannabis, or presumed true cannabis.
Presumed. Wow.
Presumed, yeah. So I can test any matrix of that. So if you can put it in there, I can test it for CBD, or even cannabis. So gummies, cookies, brownies, inhalables, whether that's plant material or, vape distillate, tinctures, lotions, honey, you name it, we've tested it.
Whatever the substance is.
Whatever the substance is.
Wow.
And the other one seems like such a simple question with yes and no answers, and here's the list and how it got there. But the reality is it isn't. For the hemp industry in Georgia, the only test that is absolutely mandated is that the farmer tests his crop prior to harvesting it. And after that, and that's only for THC. It doesn't have to be tested for CBD or anything else, just total THC. After that test, nothing is mandated in the state of Georgia.
Wow.
So your hemp, what we have are, as you mentioned, out west is a much more regulated industry.
Right.
And that's for hemp and for marijuana variety cannabis, much more regulated. So what Georgians have had to deal with, knowingly or unknowingly, is the product that we're getting out into Georgia from the west is their product that didn't pass their regulation. But because we don't have regulation, it just gets sold to us.
Wow.
So we have in the hemp industry, there are these distributors.
Okay.
And people who own shops or dispensaries have probably experienced this. They'll get the exact same COA year after year, order after order, on and on and on. They aren't correlating to a lot number. And what we have found is when we go out to these shops and test what they're actually selling as top shelf product, it's really crap. It's like 12% CBD that you're paying out of pocket for something that says it's 29% CBD.
Wow.
And the lack of regulation in Georgia around testing standards or around labeling has made it so Georgia farmers are getting out-competed by crap product.
Wow.
And So again, that kind of comes back to testing. If we can regulate that, there has to be a label on the product has to have a lot number, traceable lot number, and that lot number has to be tested with your cannabinoid profiles, your THC and CBD, plus it has to have all your safety tests. Well, then a few things happen. One, the out-of-state product that's getting sold to us because it's not passing those regulations or those thresholds, either they get out of the market or they get sold to us at a legitimate and competitive rate. So it gives our farmers an opportunity to compete in a market.
Right.
The hemp industry has suffered in Georgia because out-of-state distributors have undercut our farmers and sold fraudulent material and mislabeled material under the guise of this is California product. And the reality is Georgia has some of the best farmers. We are an agriculture state. This is our bread and butter, and we can compete with the best of them, and we do. But we can't compete with a fake COA.
Wow, there's so many just eye-opening things you've mentioned in this interview. So the hemp flower coming from California is of lesser quality, so it doesn't pass the California standards, but it's already been harvested, packaged, etc. So then they just ship it out of state to God knows where. It lands in Georgia, and then it ends up in your laboratory, and you're finding all kinds of issues with it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and not necessarily that it doesn't pass their standard, it's just not competitive there.
Right. Got it.
And so they label it, like, let's say they tested one flower years ago from that variety, which is, and this is what happens, let's say it's called cherry wine or whatever, and they tested a variety years ago and it was 22%. Well, that distributor will continue to use that COA year after year after year.
Got it.
And that's not necessarily that stellar cherry wine product that once tested at 22%.
Right, because we all know from batch to batch it varies. The environment,
right?
So many variables
involved. The farm, even different places on the
farm.
All
these phenotypes are not identical.
Right, and so that's why lot number is important. And how big is a lot? Well, 100 pounds or whatever.
Right.
The other thing is there is an expense to testing.
I was going to ask you that.
That's why I'm in business, because I have to make money, and this isn't a part of the business that makes money. So there's an expense. Well, what people have found in markets that say, like California, okay, to sell on our market, not only do you have to have your potency, but you now have to have your 5 safety tests. Well, if they know their product isn't necessarily competitive there, well, then they just slap a variety COA on it, not a lot COA. They don't worry about all the safety tests, because now they've saved a lot of money.
Right.
For that lot.
And not to interrupt you, for those who may not know, can you explain what a COA is for listeners who might not be aware?
Yeah, so COA is a certificate of analysis. And this is something that consumers should really educate themselves on, and something they should be asking shops for. So when you go buy a product and it says on the label, let's see, I'm looking at something right now. What does it say? Like 25 milligrams per gummy, whatever.
Right.
You want to ask that shop, okay, can I see the COA? That's your certificate of analysis. What you want to look at on that certificate of analysis is there a lot number on the product you're purchasing? And does that lot number reflect the lot number on the certificate of analysis?
Gotcha.
If not, then you're not actually buying the product that's on that COA.
Got it.
You want to make sure that that the potency, that what it's saying on the certificate of analysis matches the label. So the certificate of analysis, a good target or something that is truthful is going to be within 10% of that label,
right,
plus or minus. So if you're buying something that's a 3,000 milligram tincture and it's, 2,700 milligrams, that's still a true analysis. It's within that 10%.
It still falls within the range.
Yes, exactly. So you want to make sure that the lot number matches, that it articulates what that label says, and that it matches that label as far as what the potency is.
Got it.
And then you want to look for, is there a pesticide test? And are those pesticides all passing?
Mm,
Is there a residual solvent test, especially for tinctures or vape cartridges? This is super, super important. Is there a residual solvents test? And does it pass all of those? Is there a heavy metals test? Again, super important for a vape cart. Is there a heavy metals test and did it pass?
right.
Is there a microbial test? This is important for things like lotions or things that you're going to eat in your body.
Right.
Is there a microbial test and did it pass?
Right.
Is there a mycotoxin test? So Aspergillus is a natural mold that grows on farm crops,
Right.
period.
Everywhere.
Hemp is susceptible. And after Aspergillus ages, it becomes mycotoxins, which are a
Mm.
life-threatening chemical. Did it get a mycotoxin test and did it pass? And if the answers to all those questions aren't yes, then that product would not meet the standard in pretty much any other market in the country.
So I have a quick nerd question because I have a little cultivation experience. How long does it take in the aging process for Aspergillus to turn into a mycotoxin?
And so it kind of depends. Mycotoxin, so I can test a product and it pop up for Aspergillus, but it doesn't necessarily have like a full and evident Aspergillus infection.
Okay.
It's just the spore of the mold
Right.
was there. And so there's a potential for that to turn into an Aspergillus infection. Once Aspergillus blooms and starts sporing, mycotoxins are produced in the life cycle of Aspergillus. So just because I can detect Aspergillus doesn't mean that I also detect a quantifiable amount of mycotoxin.
Got it.
What it tells me is there's a potential for mycotoxin.
Right.
So if I'm looking at fresh plant material and I have a positive Aspergillus test, which to be honest, for outside product is about a 50% chance.
Right.
Then what that tells me is that
When you
this
say
product,
when you say outside, you mean outdoor grown?
yes, correct.
Right.
So what that really tells me is that this product is better suited for oil process. It's still very usable.
Right.
It just needs to go to oil process. Now, if that product that had that detected Aspergillus were to sit in a warehouse, for example, or it wasn't properly stored for a year or some substantial amount of time, there's a potential for that identified Aspergillus to turn into a quantifiable mycotoxin.
Right.
And
If
at
it's in
that
a
point,
dark, moist, dirty area.
yeah, where it gives that life cycle time to kind of take over. And that could render the product completely useless. It's much more difficult to deal with once there's mycotoxin. So it's important for people who are growing plant material to know whether they have Aspergillus there or not, and making their decision on how to move forward with the market, because it's still a usable product.
Right.
It just needs to be used in a different way. That's not a smokable product.
Right.
It needs to go to oil.
Very interesting. And so does Aspergillus grow? I'm under the assumption that it grows less in the indoor cultivation environment, but it still has the potential to grow though.
Oh, absolutely. It has the potential to grow. It happens, things grown indoor screen for Aspergillus less. Not so much because of, it's a tighter controlled environment.
Got it.
So it's just
because,
yeah, it's just right. And you're controlling most of those variables. So the water source, you don't have rain, you don't have animals coming in to your field. You don't have a neighbor growing peanuts in Georgia, huge peanut farms, right? So Aspergillus flavus is really prominent in peanuts. In fact, it's so interesting. So such a common problem that peanuts have to get tested for Aspergillus coming out of the field. So if you are growing hemp in South Georgia next to a peanut farm, well, your risk for Aspergillus has increased because this is a sporing mold. So you're going to
the wind might take it.
Yeah, exactly. So it may, again, you may not end up with a mold infection and you may not end up with mycotoxins, but you may end up with that detectable Aspergillus, which could lead you to the potential of having mycotoxins. Wow,
that is just so fascinating. And I think after having said all of that, you mentioned that the only test that's required by the state is to differentiate it from Delta 8 and Delta 9.
Well, not to differentiate from the Delta 8 test is not a requirement in the state of
Okay.
Georgia. The only test that's required in the state of Georgia is the farmer test the product prior to harvest, and that be the total THC be under 0.3% before they get it out of the field.
Got it.
Or
So,
before they trim it up. After that, even like your shops or what you purchase, like the COAs there, none of it is regulated. It's not regulated that the safety's tested. It's not regulated that the label be even correct.
right. So all of those things that you mentioned, mycotoxins, pesticides, heavy metals, microbials, all of these things could be in the flower that the consumers are using every day out there, and they have no idea.
Absolutely, yes.
They could be somebody smoking Aspergillus right now.
Yeah, that's very possible. And it's also it's even more likely that somebody is out there spending money on their 29% CBD product with no detectable THC.
Oh, for sure.
They're going to pass a drug test. And it's about 12% CBD and, 1.2% THC.
Right. And they're going to fail that drug test.
Well, yeah, that. And also it's just not what you're paying for. I mean, You're paying a substantial amount of money. These shops are paying substantial amounts of money, trusting that these distributors are okay. And I've heard there's two different sort of sides to the dispensaries. And these are, honest conversations. I've heard from some of them, I just need a COA that says it's legal. I don't really care what it is.
Right.
And then there's the people who are like, okay, I want to do it right, but then I'm running into the consumer coming in and telling me what it is that they want.
Right.
And at the end of the day, the certificate of analysis is what's telling you what it actually is. And whether you want, whatever you want is sort of irrelevant. This is what the actual is. And so when you go to a shop and you buy a Delta 8 vape that says there's no detectable Delta 9 THC, you're buying what you want to read and what you want to see. But the reality is it does have detectable Delta 9 THC. And I've never tested a vape cartridge that's a Delta 8 vape cartridge that's come back compliant and legal.
Wow. Wait, I'm sorry. I had to make sure I understood that. Yeah. You said you have never tested, and you've been in operation since 2019.
Mm-hmm.
You have yet to test a vape cartridge that came in, they were alleging that it was compliant.
Mm-hmm. And
you tested it, and you have yet to test a compliant vape cartridge.
Yeah. So
wow.
I want to back up for a second and kind of touch on Delta 8.
Right, please.
Delta 8 is legal. Delta 8 is a good product, and there is a marketplace for Delta 8. But it's really important to understand how Delta 8 is made. Delta 8 that is made in the market right now is coming from CBD oil and distillate that we got too much of in the market several years ago. And so people are taking this CBD and they're forcing a chemical reaction to create Delta 9 THC. And they use something extremely low. So really acidic chemical like acetic acid, which airs out my pH meter. It is so acidic, it will air out my pH meter. So I take CBD, wash it in acetic acid, create Delta 9 THC. And then they're going to force Delta 9 THC, which is a stable THC isomer that will be created in nature.
Right.
They're going to force that into Delta 8 THC with another acetic acid. So we're going to need a lot of energy. That's why we use something that's really acidic. Delta 8 is not the most stable isomer of THC. If it were, that's what the plant would make, but it's not. So to get to Delta 8 THC, we've now gone through two chemical reactions. So if you look at something and they say this is pure Delta 8, then they're claiming they've had 100% recovery twice. And any chemist will tell you they're never going to have 100% recovery.
Right, it's not going to happen.
And so not only have we not been able to remove all the Delta 9 THC, which is the middle part of this process, but we've created stray isomers as well. One of those primary stray isomers is something called exo-THC.
Okay.
And then there's about 3 other THC isomers that are created every time in this reaction that we haven't been able to conclusively identify. But we know when we run it that there's a lot going on in these mixtures. So what happens on a standard test, let's say you send me in a sample and I run it and I get that there is 1% delta 9 THC and there's 10% CBD.
And when you say a sample, how much of a sample are we talking about?
Oh, it's not much, like a gram or
Gotcha.
something.
Okay.
But let's say you send that in and I send you back those results. Well, before I tell you what I quantify it as, my machine's going to check for a purity factor.
Right.
It's going to make sure that what I'm saying is delta 9 THC is actually delta 9 THC.
It's valid.
What I'm saying is CBD is actually CBD. And if it doesn't hit that purity factor, then it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not that chemical. It means there may be another chemical involved. So we call that coelution.
Okay.
What happened with the Delta 8 industry is when we run Delta 8, there's a Delta 9 peak that comes up.
Okay.
But it may not reach that purity factor.
Interesting.
Well, if we keep testing something and it keeps happening, then a good scientist figures out what is that coelutant. It's
right.
Basic chromatography. What is coeluting?
Right.
And the answer for what is coeluting with Delta 9 on a Delta 8 sample is exo-THC. So we have in my lab a completely separate method that we use on Delta 8 samples. And we have separated out the coelutant for THC and exo-THC. So now they both hit our purity factors. And when we run that test, we can confidently say that that Delta 9 is Delta 9. And it is always, always present, period.
Wow, period.
Yes. And now if you look at Delta 8 gummies, that Delta 9 is diluted enough that it's a legal and compliant product.
Got it.
But in a vape cart, we've seen Delta 9 come back as high as 20%. And we've seen it, the best product I've ever tested only came back at 3%. But 3% is still 10 times legal.
I was about to say the legal threshold is what, 0.3 or something?
0.3%.
Right.
So if you are looking at a COA, whether you're a shop owner, whether you're a consumer, and you're looking at a Delta 8 COA, and all it says is Delta 8, whatever amount, Delta 9 not detected, then what they're doing is saying, well, it didn't hit the purity factor, so I'm not going to call it. They didn't go the step further to prove that, in fact, there is Delta 9 there.
Right.
The sucky part of that is it puts liability on shop owners and it puts liability on consumers. And even if you have that COA, well, the GBI can test on the second method. And they can prove that it is Delta 9.
Very interesting. So when does the GBI get involved in the cannabis testing universe?
Yeah, so your local police, they pull you over and take a sample. They don't have the lab to test it.
Absolutely.
So it goes to GBI.
Right.
So GBI takes over all of that.
So let me ask you something. Speaking of people being pulled over, are you aware or have you heard these rumors of it's different? Man, I can't think of where this was. I'm upset. Where so I want to say it was in Georgia, but in a rural county, or it might have been Florida, but it was somewhere in the southeast, where police officers are pulling people over, and I don't know if people are telling the truth or they're just trying to get out of their situation, but they might have some kind of cannabis flower and they're saying, oh no, this is Delta 8 CBD, it's legal. And then the officer takes it to the back of their car and they do a test. And then it comes back and they say, no, there's THC present, or so on and so forth. Are you hearing these stories, or are you aware of this? Because nobody's aware of some side of the road cannabis field test that is valid and reliable.
Yeah, so there's actually 2 field tests that they use on the side of the road. And they are when used together, they are very accurate in
Oh, really?
detecting THC. They are not accurate in differentiating between hemp and marijuana variety cannabis. They only detect THC. They don't detect how much is there. And as we
Got
know,
it.
our law specifies what's legal or not based on the percent. So the
Interesting.
only way for a cop to say that, or anybody to say that this is marijuana variety cannabis or this is hemp variety cannabis, is to use an equipment like we have. So
Right.
HPLC, LCMS, GCMS, and that's what the GBI is using. So if there's a substantial amount there, then the GBI will test it for them, and the GBI will use an LCMS or a GCMS to quantify it.
Wow, that's interesting. I'm glad that this came up because I've been very curious, and you're the expert in this. And so you're saying if I get pulled over in Madison County, Georgia, which is on the border of South Carolina, I've had some issues.
I was like, that's an oddly specific
Man, let me tell you, we'll save that for another interview. But yeah, if I'm passing through Madison County and I have some pre-rolls on me, this officer can crack that open, put it in. I'm guessing it's like a cocaine test or turns a color or something like that. Or, right. So he can take a little sample of this flower and magically he'll determine that this is THC. There's THC present. He doesn't know how much, but he knows it's present.
Yes, exactly. And
wow.
And like I said, there's two of them. So one turns red, and I think that's a Duquine something. I don't remember the chemical name for it. And the other is like blue salts, and it turns blue.
Right.
Wow. And in fact, we did a test in the lab, and a hemp derived THC free tincture. So THC free, our level of quantification is 0.05%. So
that's small. That's tiny.
It is less than what I quantify, and so we call it THC free.
Yeah.
But this tincture actually had a slight positive on the blue salt, so it can definitely tell.
Wow. It's sensitive.
It's pretty sensitive at detecting the presence of THC, or even possibly even cannabinoids. I'm not sure. I haven't done that much digging on it, but
wow.
Police know now, or they should know. And if they don't know, then either they haven't been listening or they're using ignorance to harass people. They should know that field tests are not able to differentiate between legal cannabis and marijuana variety cannabis. So, and we, you're talking about you asked earlier, like the difference about the difference between hemp and cannabis. So I keep saying marijuana variety or hemp variety cannabis. I don't love the word marijuana.
Oh yeah, I can't stand it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a negative association with that word. So it is all cannabis, whether that's hemp, medicinal or recreational variety, adult access, however you want to term it. It is cannabis. And they're specifically cannabis sativa, indica, and all of that are strains of the species of cannabis sativa.
Absolutely.
And hemp is just a strain off of that species. The difference between hemp or medicinal, recreational, and adult access cannabis is hemp has a predominant cannabinoid other than THC. So that can be CBDV, CBC, CBG, CBD. And it has THC, at least when it's in the field, of less than 0.3% total THC. Your medicinal, recreational, and adult access cannabis, which is colloquially termed marijuana, is going to be your THC dominant varieties or your hybrid varieties. And that's really the difference. But it is all the same exact plant.
It's all cannabis.
So like in Georgia, for our medicinal law, we were talking about testing and regulations. Medicinal law in Georgia is going to require all of those tests to be done. It's going to require a lot size. It's going to require that the label matches the certificate of analysis. And my argument has been, well, if you find it important enough to do on medicinal cannabis, this is the exact same product as hemp variety cannabis. The same risk exists Therefore, the same type of regulation should exist, but they're the
Absolutely.
same across the board.
Absolutely. And I was going to ask you that, right? To talk about more your education. You have a Master of Science, I hope I get this right, in molecular genetics and biochemistry, right?
That's correct. Yep.
Right. And from Georgia State. So
That's right.
with an education, with a stellar education background, a passion for cannabis, what is your vision for the future of regulation on a state and federal level? Because a lot of people say, look, we just need federal guidelines across the board for all states, you know, because for some of the listeners and viewers that don't know, the regulations vary from state to state. One state checks for 100 pesticides, the next state checks for 5, and so on and so forth, in all the different categories, right? And so what's your vision of, you know, in your perfect utopian cannabis testing world, what would that look like in terms of what you think would be sufficient for the consumer? Because really that's all that matters at the end of the day, is the consumer. The consumer drives the industry. The
Right.
consumer is the P&L. So if the consumer is not safe, then there is no industry, right? And so
Right.
what does that look like for you? I know that's kind of an open question, but
Well, you know, talking about the consumer driving the industry and how we got here in the first place, when California voted to have medicinal cannabis back in 98 or 99,
96.
they didn't have, huh?
96.
96. Okay. Sorry.
Right. No, so
When
I was 13. That was a very special time of my life.
when the market came online, there actually ended up being quite a lot of problems.
Oh, for sure.
There wasn't quality product. It wasn't consistent.
Right.
There were some safety issues and concerns. So it was actually a group of scientists who got together in California and started talking and went to their legislator and lobbying that there needed to be some sort of documentation, some sort of testing standard in place to make sure that these medicinal patients were getting good quality medicine.
Absolutely.
Oregon ended up coming online pretty much right after California, about 1.5 years or 2 years later. And this group of California scientists ended up influencing Oregon to take on these testing standards as part of their law.
Right.
So Oregon set the bar. Now,
and
California,
I think they had, sorry to interrupt, they had like the most stringent rules even today, right?
Yes.
Right. I'm sorry.
But so California really set the bar as far as what that quality and testing standard needed to look like. Now, California has since gone back and retroactively amended their legislation to include testing standards.
Right.
But ever since Oregon implemented that, every single medicinal recreational cannabis bill in this country has followed some sort of testing standard.
Right.
And they include the basics: pesticides, mycotoxins, residual solvents, microbial, heavy metals, terpenes, and cannabinoids are generally what we're looking at. And everything's followed that. So Colorado has a really great bill as well, that in their legislation for how testing standards work.
Right.
Now, that being said, California, and that really became the success of the market. Once that was implemented, people started testing their product in California before the legislator put that into the bill, because they realized that was going to be how it became successful. Right. So today, that's just standard. It has been the precedent. But as far as who gets to control that legislation, I think it's difficult, because one of the things that I see in California, we use California standards just because we don't have any in Georgia, and we basically had to pick, and most labs in the East Coast are going to use Colorado, Oregon, or California standards. So we picked California. And there are some pesticides that California gets really angry about that is pretty ubiquitous in Georgia, and vice versa. So we have different agricultural industries and different approaches to that.
Right.
And so, for example, piperonal butoxide, or PBO, is a common pesticide that's found in Georgia. It's pretty ubiquitous, and it is in our mosquito spray. So we know those mosquito trucks that come around, which is a public health initiative in Georgia, actually contains pesticides, shockingly, right? So this is what's found it ends up being found in our water, our soils, and our agriculture. It's not enough to necessarily hurt people.
Right.
But it's enough that, but it's in there, and it's enough that California might get upset about it. Or we have big vegetable farms, and so we use something called Residual Gold, is a really popular pesticide for vegetable farmers.
Right.
And it's pretty persistent in our soil. So hemp grown in areas that are also doing vegetable farms will often pop up for this Residual Gold. So I think at a state level, I think at a federal level, there should be a regulation of the state needs to have a set rule, a set limit, you know, that's specific to, you know, obviously it's meeting safety standards. So, you know, we would refer to the FDA and the EPA for what is a safe, you know, human standard.
Right.
But then really make it applicable to what the actual agricultural industry is in that state.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a broad paint, you know, broad painting from the federal government and more specific at the state levels, because Georgia is going to respond, especially like I said, heavy metals, we have arsenic, and California may not have that in their soil. So how we respond to our specific agricultural challenges need to be kind of in the details and talked about.
That makes perfect sense. And, you know, up until this interview, it made sense to me to just have some federal broad, you know, standards that are realistic for states to accomplish. But to your point, every state has its own agricultural needs and industry. And it might not, it's just not realistic, right, to just impose one state's laws on the others when we're growing peanuts here, we're growing this and that. That makes a lot of sense. However, like you said, we have to rely on the FDA and the EPA to tell us what are acceptable levels for human consumption, and then just go from
and
there.
They have that. I mean, part of those licenses that pesticide companies and fungicide companies are applying for includes these long-term studies, these reproductive life cycle studies, all of these things. So we have the answers. But California loves to butt heads with the EPA. They have their own, the California Environmental Agency is super, super strict.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think that's got to happen on the specifics have to happen on a state level just for feasibility. But we do have all that information on pesticides, and that makes it pretty easy to lay out guidance that's specific there to the state. So.
Absolutely. Well, look, thank you so much. One more question. I don't want to take up too much of your time. I want to stay in the range in which we allotted. But this has been such a great interview, and I'd love to talk to you more because I have so many questions about cannabinoid profiles and terpenes and your thoughts on this whole plant paradigm, right? And you know, people are using the CBD, CBG, CBN isolates, but some people are saying, hey, it's the entire flower with the terpenes and the cannabinoids working in concert. That's a whole nother conversation. But for the young people who are going to watch this, who are undergraduate students or maybe even high school students, and they're looking at this, they're young pioneers of this next generation, looking at maybe their future. Is biology, molecular genetics, biochemistry, are those majors or areas of study that students need to be focused on, or is it a wider range in terms of young people that want to get specifically into the laboratory science of cannabis?
Yeah, I think, well, I think there's several different options, definitely in the STEM industry, and we can use all of those different parts. There's, like we mentioned, microbial before. That's really going to be more geared towards biology. So microbial is the first, microbiology is the first job I had out of college. So that's really where my expertise lies. And then it sort of expanded just from job experience into more of the biochemistry and the chemistry and the chromatography side. But really what I would say is somewhere along the lines of biology, chemistry, organic chemistry, biochemistry, even engineering, because we need all of those pieces to really make the science side of it work. Microbiology is typically very different from heavy metals testing, for example.
Got it.
But over the career of a scientist, like in school, you get these little snippets of each piece of science. So people who are doing a science degree, they'll come in contact with a GC, a gas chromatography machine, or HPLC in their education.
Right.
But at least for me, when I walked away with my degree, I had no idea what that actually meant to an industry. And so it's not really until you get in there and get your feet wet that you see how all these little
Right.
snippets start to fit together in either industry or research. So what I recommend is, if you're interested in STEM, definitely the hard STEMs, your biologies, chemistries, biochem, organic chem, and then we need engineers to build the machines. But really focus on those research projects that you get, which is a part of graduation for most bachelor's degrees in Georgia. Find a research project that fits your interest or somewhere around it, because that's where you're going to see everything else come together from your education. And you'll kind of have a blend of all of the sciences. So I say focus on experience. A degree is important. It gives you a little exposure, but that experience, you can't beat experience, period.
Right. Experience is the best teacher. Right.
It is. Yeah, absolutely.
For sure. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for joining us. You shared so much, so much important information, and I think it's clear why your laboratory and laboratories in Georgia are so important to protecting the consumer. I have so many more questions. I'd love to get you on the calendar for another interview so we can really take a deeper dive on the science, and I'm so happy to hear just your advocacy and knowledge of just the industry and the history and the dilemmas that we face. And also before we leave, are you going to be at the hemp conference here in Cobb County at the end of the week?
No, I will not. So just because we're a startup, so I do the lab work here, and
you're working.
I'm working.
Right.
Yeah, no. My assistant's amazing. She keeps me running and focused, but no, unfortunately, I haven't hit the point where I have time to quite make it around to.
Understandable. I certainly want to make time to come down to Macon and see you in action and see your lab and just the pioneer groundbreaking work you're doing. And like I said, thank you so much for joining us today. And I look forward to catching up with you soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity, and hopefully some folks learned something. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to email us. We're very open to talking about the industry and sharing knowledge. So my email is SJ Nicholls, NICHOLLS at sjlabsandanalytics.com.
Absolutely. I was going to ask you to share how people can get in touch with you. Thank you so much. I look forward to chatting with you. And you have a great day. And thank you for the hard work that you do.
Yes, sir. You too. Bye.